Whenever Game of Thrones comes up in conversation, it's usually about the problems with the characters' endings that upset many viewers in the last season. However, there was once a time when Game of Thrones first premiered and was an unexpected smash hit for HBO, revitalizing the fantasy genre for a mainstream audience and changing the television landscape as we know it. Looking back on that first season, it feels like a completely different show from the one that its 8th season left off with. Like any show, Game of Thrones changed a lot as it became more and more successful, especially once it surpassed the events in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire books. Though you can't really blame the show for having to make it up as they go along in those later seasons, there are a lot of details and foreshadowing in that first season that you may have forgotten about. As it turns out, the showrunners kinda forgot about them, too. Game of Thrones Season 1 has a lot of moments viewers will never forget, from the murder of Ned Stark, to the quippy wisdom of Tyrion Lannister, and the fiery uprising of Daenerys Targaryen. Whether it's the way the characters look, the overall tone of the series, or big hints towards future events, these are 10 things you definitely forgot about the series' debut season. Time passes more quickly than you remember. There's one easy way to tell how much time is passing between each episode. Among the major criticisms of Game of Thrones' later seasons is the passage of time being all over the place, with characters traveling across Westeros within a few scenes. In the first season, moving from point A to point B takes several episodes, as evidenced by Ned and his family spending the entire second episode on the road to King's Landing, or Tyrion and Bronn spending the 8th episode making their way to Tywin Lannister's encampment. However, it's not always that slow-paced in the first season, as evidenced by the Direwolf pups found by the Starks in Game of Thrones' first episode. Though they're found as merely newborns, by only the second episode, they've grown large enough to defend the Starks against attackers, such as Bran's assassin or the petulant Prince Joffrey. A few episodes later, Jon Snow's direwolf ghost is already large enough to intimidate other Night's Watch members into laying off bullying Samwell Tarly. The White Walkers are supposed to be the real threat. The show's first scene should have been more than a red herring. It feels so obvious for so much of Game of Thrones that the petty squabbles for the Iron Throne pale in comparison to the danger Westeros is ignoring from beyond the wall. And yet, the entire White Walker army is defeated in the span of a single episode in Season 8, which is quite underwhelming given these zombie-like creatures have the honor of being introduced in the very first scene of the series, way before we ever meet Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister, or Daenerys Targaryen. Of the many reasons the White Walker's ending doesn't work in Game of Thrones probably has to do with the show betraying the promise of this first scene, in which several Night's Watch Rangers are ambushed by Whites. Even the mystery of the strange pattern of limbs gets answered in Season 6 as just reminiscent of the stone patterns present when the Night King, the first White Walker, was created. Most of Game of Thrones Season 1 is a murder mystery. The show's decline in quality might be from losing sight of its original tone. Tonally, the later seasons of Game of Thrones feel like a Marvel movie, with high-budget action sequences and quippy dialogue. Season 1 of Thrones, however, kicks off with the death of Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King and a former friend of Ned Stark. When asked by King Robert Baratheon to replace Arryn, Ned is encouraged to look into the suspicious circumstances of his death at King's Landing, unraveling a larger conspiracy regarding the Lannisters. Many of the most iconic moments in Season 1 of Game of Thrones happen as a result of this central murder mystery, but the truth about how and why Jon Arryn died, and who sent an assassin after Bran Stark, isn't fully revealed until several seasons later. Part of this intrigue was what made Game of Thrones so easy to binge-watch in those early years, rather than just tuning in for the spectacle of it all. Some Game of Thrones characters look completely different in the first season. It took a while for the show to settle on their characters' iconic looks. Obviously, we all remember how different Peter Dinklage looked as Tyrion Lannister in the first season, especially the pilot, in which his hair is as bright and blonde as his siblings. However, several other characters are just as unrecognizable, given their appearances in future episodes. There's a brief appearance from Beric Dondarrion, future leader of the Brotherhood without banners, though he's played by a different actor and doesn't have the iconic eye patch he sports in Season 3 onward. Another Game of Thrones character recast was Gregor Clegane, aka The Mountain, who was played by two different actors in Seasons 1 and 2 before Hafr Julius Bjornsson took over the role in Season 4. Additionally, some leftover scenes from the pilot feature several jarring continuity errors in the ways characters look, from Ned Stark having slicked back hair in the crypt scene with King Robert, or the Hound's incredibly poor-looking wig at the end of the first episode. Sansa Stark is very unlikable. She really came a long way before becoming Queen of the North. Although Sansa Stark has Game of Thrones' best ending, she is difficult to root for in the first season. Credit where credit's due, Sophie Turner brilliantly played Sansa as the eldest Stark daughter who believes in fairy tales, charmed by the prospect of being Joffrey's princess. As a result, she doesn't treat her family well, especially when it comes to Arya and Ned. Obviously, you can't help but feel for Sansa after she's forced to witness Joffrey sentence Ned to death, and is then taunted with the sight of her father's head on a pike in the Season 1 finale. From that point on, the average viewer feels very deeply for Sansa and roots for her to overcome her terrible circumstances, though prior to that, it's easy to blame her for turning her back on her family in the name of being in love with a guy she barely knows. Jon Snow's parentage is so obvious in hindsight the show waited over 6 seasons to tell us what Ned Stark's expressions told us in one.